The first thing I wanted to say, and this came up in a couple questions, and I thought it was a really good one, is, again, I want to stress, with regards to the natural deduction systems we're going to use here, what we have is a kind of order of strength going downwards. So what that means is that S5 is going to be our strongest system, but strongest in the sense that it has the most requirements. So what this means is that every rule we'll have for K, you can use in S5, but not the other way around. So we've only talked about the two basic rules for K so far, but the basic rules for K you can use in K, T, S4, and S5. When we get to the basic rule for S5, it's only going to work in this system. You cannot use it in any of the weaker ones. Now, the explanation for how to understand the weaker and stronger relationship here, again, I'll make a promissory note. We will talk about it next week when we get to kind of the semantics for these. But for right now, it's just easier to see them again as sort of more complex versions of the same board game. You can always do the basic moves, no matter what level of complexity you're playing. But when you're at the most complex level, there'll be things you can do that you can't do in the simpler ones. So, okay, that's that. Now, again, our two basic rules for K. We had modal ponens. That was that if you have a boxed conditional and you had a boxed antecedent, you can derive the boxed consequent. And then we talked about necessitation. So necessitation was if you can prove that a sentence is a theorem, that is, you can literally build a proof of it from nothing, then you can kick it one line to the left and put a box in front of it. You know that it isn't just true, but it must be true. Now, K is a very simple system. Those are all the rules. That's it. There's two kind of rules that make our lives a little easier, derived rules, that we'll talk about in just a second. But using these, we can already do a lot. And I thought it would be helpful for us to quickly talk through one proof, just to sort of see how doing something in K would go. So let's talk about this one from the primer. This is also one of the questions I asked you to do for the homework. So I'm going to blank it real quick after I write it down. Okay, I'm going to blank the slides real quick and we'll talk through how to do this one. So if we're going to prove this, what we'll need to do is be able to get a proof of A as a theorem or a proof of B as a theorem in order to use necessitation. That sounds really hard because atomic sentences are never going to be theorems. The other option is if we had a necessitated conditional with this at the front and A at the back, then we could use modal ponens to get A. And if we had a conditional that had this at the front and that at the back, then we could use modal ponens to get B. Before we go on, does everyone see the idea there? Okay, so let's remember our two rules, the two new rules we have. One rule was, if you have a boxed conditional and you have a boxed antecedent, then you can derive the boxed consequent. Right? So, coming back to our theorem here, or to what we want to prove here, if we had that, we could use it twice, or we could use this to get us box A. And if we had that, we could use mode opponents to get us box B. Before we go on, do we see the idea there? Using that rule we just talked about. With me so far? So, let's think then. How could we get these two? What's interesting about them?
You need a conditional, but you also need it to be a theorem.
Yeah, we need to know, are these sentences, the unboxed versions, are they theorems? What do we think? Yeah, they are. They are, right? Because if the conjunction's true, then both conjuncts have to be true. So if the conjunction's true, then this conjunct's true. Cool. So we can build a proof for that. And the same thing the other way. So we've now got a plan. We're going to show that this sentence is a theorem. And then use necessitation. Oh fuck, the world's ending. We'll build this, and then use necessitation. And then we'll do the exact same thing for this. Remember, if the antecedent's true, then what happens to the consequent? If the antecedent's true, and the antecedent is a conjunction, and what do conjunctions require to be true? They both have to be true. Conjunctions are hard to please. Cool. But that's not what we would do, right? When we do natural deduction, what we do is, if the antecedent's true, what happens with the consequent? So, let's do it. Let's talk through it quickly. The basic plan is going to be, again, to derive these as theorems. And then when we derive them as theorems, we'll use necessitation to get us their boxed versions. And then mode opponents to give us each one. So we start, just like always, by writing our assumptions down. And we know where this needs to end. What's our last rule going to be? What's the last rule we're going to invoke going to be? If we're looking at our sentence. What's the main operator of this sentence? It's a conjunction. It's conjunction introduction, right? So we're just going to build both conjuncts. That's all we're going to do. So let's start. And we're going to start in a very funny way. We're going to start by opening a subproof with no assumptions. And why are we doing it with no assumptions? Because again, we want to get to necessitation. So we go, okay, let me kick this up a little. We want to derive the boxed version of this top conditional. We want to eventually build to necessitation. That means we'll need to prove that the unboxed version is a theorem. And we can do that no problem. At line 3, what we're going to do, sub. Why our sub? Plan is to eventually end the subproof with conditional introduction. So we start with our would-be antecedent. And what can we immediately get at line 4? Well, we can get either one, right? And what's our rule going to be? Conjunction elimination on 3. Nice. And now look at our sub-proof from 3 to 4. It has already done its job. So we can close the sub-proof and we can get formulation, this conditional introduction?
No.
Right? Again, conditional introduction. Because we've shown that if A conjunction B is true, then A must be true. And now look, our subproof that went from 2 to 5 has done its job. Because we started this subproof with nothing, and we have derived this conditional. So what can we do at line 6? What's our move at line 6? Almost. Remember, why did we want to prove that this sentence was a theorem? Now we can add the box. We can do necessitation. And we go.
I don't get line 5, so I will really ask you.
Good.
So get because of the sentence work.
So what are we doing here between 2 and 5? We're proving within this subproof that from nothing at all, we can literally now open subproofs with nothing, that we can get to this sentence. We're proving it's a theorem. Okay? Now then, what do we want to do next? What's our move at line 7? Modal ponens, right? Remember, the thing up in the top right corner there, if we have the boxed version of a conditional, and we have the boxed version of the antecedent, we can get the boxed version of the consequence. Now, before we go on, do we see the thought process here? I know this is weird and hard, and we're moving fast, right? But again, the basic process here is we use the stuff that we have before, every rule we had before with natural deduction, and also the 2 rules we've learned, necessitation and modal ponens, to try and help ourselves out.
What do we care about line 7?
Good. Why do we want line 7? What's the aim? Remember where we're trying to get to.
Oh, okay.
The conjunction. What do we have? We are now Bon Jovi. We are halfway there, right? All we got to do is the other half. So, let's do the other half. Right? So just imagine that this continues on down here, and this will be line 8. And what are we going to do at line 8? What's the plan at line 8?
How do we get to box and then A conjunction B conditional A? How do we get to
This one.
Yeah, but why like
Good. So what we're doing is, again, if we can prove that a sentence is a theorem, we know that it depends on nothing at all.
I guess that's awesome. Why did you write it down?
Oh, just that was when we were planning, right? That was when we were talking about how to build the proof.
How did we find that out? Like this,
Again, thought about it. Basically, right, if we're going to get this box A and box B for our conclusion, there's going to be 2 options. One of them is either necessitation, which would require proving that A and B are theorems. Not going to happen, because they're atoms. The atoms are never theorems. Or using modal ponens. So that was why we talked ourselves into doing it this way. Okay. So now, coming back to our proof. What can we do at line 8? We're basically going to do the same damn thing. Same exact things. So we're going to open a subproof with nothing, just like at line 2, in order to, at line 9, open a sub-subproof with A conjunction B, and then B, through conjunction elimination, and then, hey, just like we did over there, we can now close this sub-subproof, get A conjunction B, therefore B, through conditional introduction. And note we've now proven that this version is also a theorem, so we can kick it one line to the left. which will be necessitation. And just like before, we now have a necessitated conditional. We also have from line 1 the necessitated antecedent. So we can get the necessitated consequent. And what's our last step? What's the final move to make here? Conjunction introduction. Okay. Now, before we go on, let's move on. I want to ask, be honest with me here, be totally honest. Who is completely in the dark? Who is totally lost? That is okay? That's, actually, I'm pleased. That's better than I thought. No, I want to stress something here, right? I want to stress something. It's all right to be confused. It's okay to be confused. This is confusing. What I'm interested in here is just a kind of, in some sense, showing you how these systems work, the kinds of things we can prove. What have we proven? We've proven that if a conjunction is necessary, then the conjuncts must be necessary too. Really intuitive. Right? If conjunction AB is necessarily true, if that conjunction must be true, well then of course the conjuncts both have to be true. But this is what it takes to show that. It's a very intuitive idea, but it turns out to be really difficult to actually show. So I'm not trying to scare you or anything. I just want you to kind of see that when we start to think about modal claims, which again, remember from the top, modal claims are everywhere in philosophy. It's going to turn out that actually what follows from them is very complex. It's very hard to figure out what actually follows from modal claims. So the best thing to take away from this, I hope you learned the natural deduction system, but the bigger thing to take away is be very skeptical of philosophical arguments that invoke these kinds of notions. And a lot of them will. Be careful. So that's, I guess, the biggest lesson to take away. Yeah, sorry.
My question was, for MP, is it important that you cite the conditional first, or does it not matter?
I don't mind. Either way. Okay. So this was our first natural deduction system. This is K. And again, 2 rules, modal ponens and necessitation. Everything built from there. When it comes to K, we also have 2 derived rules. The first derived rule has to do with possibility. Because interestingly, you'll notice, everything I've told you is just about boxes. I told you nothing about diamonds. So one of the things we can do here is we can define possibility. And we will say that A is possibly true if and only if A is not necessarily false. That is, if it's not box, not A, if it's not the case that in every situation A is false, well then A could be true. Makes sense, right? It makes sense. If not every situation is one where the switch is off, then there has to be at least one situation where it can be switched on.
It's still possible for it to be necessary as well as possible?
Absolutely. Which makes sense, right? Because being possibly true is compatible with being always true. Being possibly true just means is the case. One way to be the case is to always be the case. So we can interflip here, right? If you have not, box, not, you can replace that with just a diamond. It's worth noting that this isn't actually another rule. This is just the definition of what possibility is. For something to be possible, It just means that its negation isn't necessary. Good. Okay. It is also worth noting, and this was something that came up in the discussion earlier, there is going to be very, very, very few things that will be necessary. Just like how there's very, very few sentences that are tautologies or that are theorems. The vast majority of sentences are going to be contingent. It's hard to be a necessary truth. It's hard to be a necessary falsehood. Most sentences will be such that they could be true or could be false. Okay, so we have the definition of possibility. The other rule, the other additional rule we have for K, has to do with modal conversion. And this is actually something about how we can interplay negations and our two operators. So the first kind of version of modal conversion we have, version conversion is terrible, is if you have, it's not the case that necessarily A, that is, it's not the case that A must be true, then it's possible A is false.
Do we also get a spreadsheet for this? Do we also get a spreadsheet for this?
Yeah. I just haven't, I'll bring it for the tutorials on Thursday. So again, our first one, if you have it, it's not the case it's necessarily true, then it must possibly be false. Makes sense, right? If it's not the case that in every situation it's on, there must be at least one situation where it's false. And you can guess what the other version of modal conversion is going to be. It's going to be just flipping these around. If it's not possibly true, then it's necessarily false. If there is no situation where it's true, well then in every situation it must be false. Again, do we see the combination here, the relationship between the previous slide and this one? These conversions will work for every of our proof systems, every one. So they're just ways for us to introduce diamonds based off just playing around with boxes. My friend Tim jokingly calls it unboxing diamonds sometimes, but I don't really buy that. Anyway, so this is K. K uses these basic rules and these derived rules, and we can do a lot of stuff with it. It is the most basic modal logic in some senses. It is certainly the most basic normal modal logic. We'll skip this for now, just because we're running out of time, but we'll come back and do it in the tutorial on Thursday, because I want to make sure that we know how to do some of these. But I want to quickly go over the other three systems. So the other three systems we're going to get by adding one rule apiece. The next one is a very simple addition, but it's a very intuitive one. Strangely though, it's one that K does not give us. Here's a natural thought. If something is necessarily true, then it ought to be true. That is, box A gives you A. K doesn't let you derive that. I know, that seems really stupid. But K is so weak. It doesn't actually give you that. Necessity, necessary truth, doesn't entail actual truth. So the next system, system T, gives you that rule. And in fact, that's all it is. It takes K and it adds one more rule. And the rule is very simple. It is this idea. It's literally, if you have boxed sentence, you can unbox it. So from box A, you can get A. Note that this is also in my sexy swash font. So this means that box A becomes box A. Again, it's the idea that if something's necessarily true, then it must simply be true. Yes.
Why are these considered different systems?
Good, because you can prove different things. There's stuff you can prove in T that you cannot prove in K, and this is actually one of them.
But is there anything in K that you cannot prove with T? You can simply not use the rule, right?
You just simply
So why is K considered a system?
Good. It still is a provability system, right? It still lets you prove a bunch of things. And the important thing, so this kind of comes back to something, and this is why we talked about the different senses of necessity. You might think that different senses of necessity are best tracked by different versions of this modal logic. Put another way, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this stuff is to note that we've talked about different logical systems. So there's not really a sense in which there is the one true holy logic. Logic is a system to use. Sometimes you want different tools for different things. Maybe you want a system that's as weak as K. Here's a really funny case. I'm really interested in truth and fiction. You want a very weak logic for truth and fiction, because otherwise you end up with far too much being entailed to be true inside a given film or novel or something. K is a really good system for that, because you can get, it's necessarily true in the story, but it's not actually true. That's the kind of thing that's really useful here. It's a good question. It's a really good question. So highlighting these different systems is also my little attempt to kind of gently edge you towards a concept of logical pluralism. But don't let Michael hear that. He'll get very angry. So, again, kind of coming back, being practical. K was the very weak system. T builds on K by adding this one extra rule, that if you have boxed sentence, you can unbox it. You can get the sentence itself. Here again, we can prove stuff in T that we could not do in K. We'll talk more about it in our tutorial. Yeah.
So this is the same thing with the, what was it, real possibility, real necessity?
So the neat thing here is that when we're thinking about the boxes, what sense of modality these are linked to, we're being completely neutral. We could use this to model real possibility and necessity. We could use this to model nomological possibility and necessity, logical possibility and necessity. We're staying happy, fair, and free, right? We're just thinking about how would musts and cans logically function. Which kind of must and can? That's somebody else's business, at least for now. At least for now. We're going to talk about it next week. So we got T, okay? Again, T, really handy rule, very sensible rule. Our third system, S4, builds on T by incorporating one further move. And the idea for S4 is actually kind of funny on its face, but it makes sense. It's that, look, if something is necessary, then its being necessary couldn't fail to also be true. Again, the fact that it is necessarily true, right? That fact, that this sentence is necessarily true, that fact looks like it must be true as well. That is, it must be true that this thing must be true. We see the idea? So the fact that, if A, then A is true, cool, that gave us, it's necessarily true. Well, the fact that that sentence is necessarily true also doesn't look like it could ever be false. So necessitation implies necessary necessitation. Yeah?
But couldn't this go all purple?
Oh, yeah.
So what's the point of it?
Good. But again, note what we're thinking about here is effectively that same kind of situation before when we talked about Rob running at 25 miles an hour. It's possible that he does. Is it possibly possible that he does? Are there situations we could kind of jump to where then you could jump to Rob running 25?
So when I get like
two of these things that is like logical, but imagine 6.
Yeah.
What's the point of it?
Good. So again, if at any point it starts to wobble, right, then we've learned something very weird. That for some reason, while we can box and box and box up to 6, then it breaks down. Why that? That sounds either arbitrary or that there's something really deep about the logical system here.
Is that to do anything with the non-logical and logical truth possibilities?
We can run with this any sense of logic you want, any kind of possibility and necessity.
Yeah, but what makes it wobble then?
Good. Well, that would be the trick. If it turns out that we're just going to stipulate there's a limitation, the question then is, why did we pick that arbitrary cutoff point? Right? And if it is just arbitrary, that doesn't seem like a good reason to kind of forego logic. If it turns out that there's like a deep logical reason for these operators to break down, that's weird. And we can stack an infinite number of negations and not have any problems. These work like negation. Why is it suddenly if we put up 6 or whatever, we run into an issue? That seems strange. That would then cry out for a philosophical or logical explanation. That's the kind of motivation.
So it could be like 4 boxes and 2 possibilities and 4 boxes.
Note, the only thing that we've talked about here is that one box can give you 2. You can add boxes. I didn't say nothing about diamonds.
But the combination is possible.
Maybe. But we don't have a rule yet that lets us do that.
But doesn't this just imply that this goes on forever? Because now it's necessary, so there can be another box, which makes it necessary, which adds another box.
Good. So we can keep adding boxes. Once you have one, you can pile up as many as you like. You just keep running this move. But you only ever get boxes. Didn't say anything at all yet about adding diamonds.
But why would you keep adding boxes?
Good. So this is actually a really fun principle if you start to think about how things could change over time. Because you'll very quickly run into cases that look like it violate this rule. The way something is at a moment versus the way it is way down the line looks like it's going to give you different ranges of immediate possibilities and immediate necessities, such that it's not going to turn out that it's necessarily necessary that it's made of these parts, say. It's a weird case, but there are weird philosophical instances that break this rule. Yeah.
You just said over time. We not.
No. We're not even thinking about that. But you can think of times as basically possible situations. So that's the kind of idea. Okay. So again, if we're thinking of S4, it has this rule, the S4 rule. If you have a box sentence, you can stick a box in front. Now again, it's worth stressing. The S4 rule lets you add boxes. It doesn't let you add diamonds. There's an interesting thing to prove, and we'll talk about this on Thursday, is this rule of adding boxes corresponds to removing diamonds, but not the other way around. Okay, we'll have to prove it, but we'll talk about it on Thursday. So S4 gives us, if you've got box P, you can get box P. And our last system, S5, the last thing we want to talk about. S5 is the one that in some ways is the most intuitive. It's that if something's possible, then it's necessarily possible. To put it in terms of that sort of getting to Rob running 25 miles an hour, it's that if it's possible for Rob to run 25 miles an hour from here, then every possible situation can get to one where he runs 25.
If this is always the case, then why would we write it down?
Good. So that's the kind of cool thing. If it turns out that this rule is correct, you can go up and down in terms of boxes. All that matters is the last operator.
But it must be.
Only on this system. All the other ones don't let you do that. It's going to turn out, so this is again something we're kind of thinking about this purely natural deductively. I'm going to talk about the interpretations next week. But to actually get things to work this way, you've got to have some pretty heavy assumptions. And there's reasons to be worried that these assumptions don't work. Again, we can kind of think about it in a very simple case. Everyone familiar with the ship of Theseus? The ship of Theseus looks like a case against this. Because you could have it be made of 3 parts in this instance, have it made of totally different parts in this instance, and then think about, cool, what could we build from this? And you will get, it's possible relative to one instance where we build it, and it's not possible relative to another. Again, we'll talk a little bit about it once we get to our interpretation. Right now, it's very helpful just to think about these purely natural deductive. So, let me just wrap up with this. I want to stress, I very much appreciate that this is difficult and awkward. What we're going to do on Thursday in the tutorials, we'll talk about some of these proofs. Also note, you do not need to do all of them, right? Do these. These are the shorter ones, the relatively simpler ones. These are also the ones in the assignments. Great. So if you check the assignment, it will have these listed as well. We're going to talk through as many of these as we can on Thursday. For next week, the plan to talk about interpretations for modal logic. We're going to explain the relationships here and try and highlight about how to make sense of when these sentences are true and false. Thanks for coming, guys. Have a good week, and we'll see you all Thursday.